Thank you for showing up, guys. First of all, I would like to thank the Hillyer for the opportunities. Oftentimes, it's sort of quite hard to see Vietnamese in a setting other than a pho restaurant or a nail salon. So it is a great opportunity having to share my families and our journey, how we ended up in the United States and how we settle here as Americans. As you can see, my work begins with the escape of my aunt and uncle who left Vietnam in 1978. This was probably 3 years after what was declared at the end of the Vietnam War. And majority of that time span, a lot of Vietnamese sort of fled by boat, and they ended up on a boat, ended up in the middle of the sea, raided by pirates. There were a lot of pirates at that time around that area because they knew that there was a lot of Vietnamese who was trying to escape Vietnam. And so what they did is they plundered, took a lot of possessions, but sometimes women's also too. And so when the pirates raided the boat, they sort of stranded them there and sort of plunged into the gas tank and left them stranded at sea. Luckily, there was a Dutch vessel that came by and sort of rescued my aunt and uncle's family, and then they pulled them to the nearest port, which was Philippines. At that time, the reason why the Dutch vessel wasn't allowed to take on any refugees was because at that time, Vietnam was being embargoed, and any diplomatic relationship that if you have with the United States, you cannot extend it to Vietnam. And so as Vietnamese citizens are on the boat, they're not allowed to take them up as refugees. And so that was the first group of refugees that came. Then my family, which my uncle and my fathers were prisoner of war after the Vietnam War because they're high commanding officers. We fled Vietnam after my uncle, who served 13 years in sort of re-education camps. And from there, they sort of came and sort of, we knew that it wasn't safe for us to be in Vietnam, so the only way for us to escape was sort of create this tourist guise that we were gonna go to Thailand to have a vacation, but as soon as we left to pass the border, we immediately fled for Bangkok and the embassy, and from the embassy, because my uncle and my dad was prisoner of war after the Vietnam War, we were able to sort of file paperwork to be refugees in Thailand. And the last set of bodies is of my wife's family, who were stranded as the third group of Vietnamese who sort of fled Vietnam during the 90s. And because the fact that she came into camp when she was 2 and left camp at 8.5, almost 9, was the fact that 1994, 95, President Clinton lifted the embargo and allowed a lot of Vietnamese who were refugees at that time, who were in refugee camps. They forced to close all the camp because the fact that there was no longer an embargo on Vietnam. And they forced lots of Vietnamese who were in refugee camps to go back to Vietnam. And they had to do paperwork that way. And so I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, the Midwest. And what I love about growing up in the Midwest was the notions of creating story. And so as an artist, I often think about when I go into institutions or museums, how can I talk about my family? And of all the wonderful painter and all the commissions throughout the painting, the history of painting was made by people who were in power, but at the same time who can sort of create some sense of history or legacy for their family. But here, as coming from a family of refugees, there's no sense of root or rootedness in it. And so it's often hard for me to sort of create some sense of identity. How do I create sense of belonging? And so one time, one of my best friends, on her sweet 16th birthday, she had this dramatic breakdown with her mom. But in her scrapbook, she create all these pictures, and she brought it out and said, "Oh, remember this?" And then I think I looked at her and said, "You had a meltdown with your mother during that day." "Oh, did I? I don't remember that." And so for me, it was fascinating because the fact of here she is, she's celebrating one of her most eventful things in her life, but at the same time, that dramatic experience, she sort of blocked out. And scrapbookings, I'm fascinated with it because here you can get to embellish. You can create the stories, the narratives that you need to create. And so for me, it was an easy opening path for me to sort of access. Here, I can see that I can create my own narrative about my family, but at the same time, not necessarily weigh too heavily on being a person from a war or a person who is in a refugee camp. And so rather than just think about the negative experience, I've thought about more like the positive experience of how do I construct my own family identity through these. And it was from that I began to construct these painting with all the different patterns. And I was raised in a printmaking experience. And because the fact that I like to take one single shapes and objects and keep repeating it over, like for example, I love using the hexagon, particularly because of the metro. They're all over the floor, and whenever I see them, I think how my mind would sort of wander. And as a printmaker, I try to think of how can I take one single shape, rotate and repeat it, and then take things away, pulling back, and then create my own design. And that's how I begin to create sort of these patterns within my painting, sort of connecting my Midwest upbringing, but at the same time living here, plant-based here in DC, but yet talking about my family and their identity. The other thing that I'm also attracted to this whole process is that I love going to Michael's and you know, I get these buckets of jewels. There's something about these cheap replaceable materials that resonates with me, because the fact that by the time the COVID hit and the talk about immigrants, refugees, also to the refugee crisis in Europe at the same time was on the back of my mind at the same time, because I'm thinking about these people who don't have a place or don't have a sense of belonging. And so at night, I'm taking all these buckets from Michael's and I'm just sorted out, you know, like navettes, purple hearts, you know, like diamonds, triangle. As I separate these, I begin to sort of feel connected, because it triggered another part of my memories, is that remembering back to my childhood when I was in a refugee camp. We were 594 families sort of spread out from one end of 2 football field of factory, from one end to the other. And the only way that we know our space is we use luggages as sort of like border around us. And so doing these separations of jewels and putting them in different piles on my long table, I begin to think about, oh, so this is what it is about. These things that society deems as cheap, replaceable, that they're not worth anything. They're not valuable. They're not like your high-end Swarovski crystal. They're not your Tiffany diamonds, you know? These are just things that people don't seem necessary. And so for me to have a space in my own painting and allowing each of these individual jewels to have their own place, making their own sort of significance and allowing them to shine in their own way is me seeing myself as, oh, this is my family. This is why we're not so participatory in the American culture, is that we're absent, but yet we don't, because all my life, my family, we use second-handed stuff ever since we came to the United States. Remembering, like, even in middle school, all the other kids are wearing those nice new Adidas shirts, and then here I have like these neon glowing light, Happy July 4th, 1989. It's like, it does a lot to my ego, but then the sense of like, I'm living through second-handed stuff, And so for me, I grew an affinity to sort of these sorting the jewels, sitting there, removing things. And as I begin to create, I think about how can I take these simple little hexagon patterns that I intricately design in all my painting, how can I bring it out to life? And I begin to think about the vinyl cutter and things, because at first I used X-Acto knife to cut out all these patterns. And like my hands hurt so much. And then all the other artists like, there gotta be a more efficient way to do this. And so my wife loved crickets, and she cut out vinyl lettering all the time to make, to tag on to everything. And once I began seeing that, I was like, oh, how can I turn a lot of these patterns into these my own way? And so I began to sit down and vectorize a lot of my patterns in the same way that crickets sort of take some of these and cut out in their own vinyl lettering. And as I began to make this, I began to think about what was happening was our withdrawal from Afghanistan. I believe that night we put my 2-year-old son to bed. And as we put it to bed, we see all these images flooding in, and they say, this is our final trip as the Americans are withdrawing, the plane's about to leave the tarmac. We see all these Afghans throwing their babies at soldiers, and they're running on the tarmac, hanging on to the planes. And for me, I wept that night with my wife, because we just begin to feel like, oh, this is Vietnam all over again. It's almost like that black and white image of the helicopters leaving, and as parents taking their children and throwing them up on the boat, hoping that they would be safely escape Saigon as the North about to strike right into the city. And so for me, that moment is when I begin in my studio taking all these individual patterns that I make, clinging together, because I begin to ask in my mind, what is the price of that lives holding on to each other, trying to. And as you can see, these patterns become sort of the building block, and they warp and morph based on gravity. But at the same time, they become to create barriers, these fences that you don't normally see. Because as a child, I didn't see fences. All I see was, what's going on beyond this compound and this experience? And so for me, I didn't think about those things, and all these things intermix in my mind. And as I begin to create these installations, I watch all these people running onto the tarmac as they hang on to the airplane. I think about like zombie movies, like when the zombie is like all crawling, and thinking about humans hanging on to their own lives. And having this was me connecting to watching gravity, watching real life bending and morphing, these intricate things that I create, all made out of sort of recycled paper. And so I don't normally get the experience to put them together in my studio, of course. They're all like 4x8. And then now having the opportunity to show, I wanted to create an installation, but allowing you to see, you know, like for me, these are a metaphor of lives hanging together, but at the same time, these are my intricate memories of being, whether I'm being behind something, looking at something, or in front of something, looking at something. And it's always sort of like that barrier. And I hope that having the opportunity, the experience to create these patterns and allowing you to maybe share that same feelings, because there's a lot of things happening in our world, things that I don't think a lot of us feel comfortable about, but yet it's in the back of our mind. We think about it all the time. War, tragedies, things that's happening in Hamas, things that happening not only far away from us, but down south of our border. Children's separation from their parents at the border, you know. These are things that I think about all the time, but yet they trickle into my arts little by little, triggering a lot of the trauma that I've experienced as a past. But at the same time, I just want to celebrate my family. I cannot speak for all immigrants or refugees throughout the world, but I can only speak from my own personal experience, what my family have to endure to be here, but yet giving the opportunity how we made our lives. And yet I hope that it give a better example than what the definitions of immigrants or refugees can have on the rest of the world or society. Wow, that was a lot.
You said you ended up in the Midwest. How did that happen? There was recently an article in the Post about all the Vietnamese that came to Arlington, and I know that was a center. How did the Midwest become?
So that's a great question. The refugees who are coming to the Arlingtons, think of them as political officers. They have political ranking, and they're allowed to leave first, and they're connected a lot to the base connections here with all the embassy. The second group is, like I was saying, is sort of like military personnel, high-ranking officer or soldiers of who are prisoners of war. And mainly they're from the 80s, and they're spread from between St. Louis, Houston, Texas have a huge immigrant populations. California, Bosa, that was another one. But mainly they're concentrated. The reason I ended up here was because of my aunt. She, as soon as the United Nations have declared us political refugees, my aunt was able to help sponsor my family. And because they were in the United States already, the fact that I go toward the Midwest, otherwise I would end up either in California or Houston, Texas.
So your aunt was here?
Yes, that family made it 1978. They left. They stuck in there in maybe June of 1978. They left November of 1979. And so they left the Philippines, and they got sponsored by an American family in St. Louis. And so they were able to leave and settle in St. Louis, Missouri. And that's how I end up.
But then they came here, or no?
No, they didn't come here. I end up here because New Hope, Obama got elected. The sense of hope was there. I really wanted to, I felt like politically charged, but at the same time I was also running away from one of my mentor, who is Carrie Mae Weems, photographer. I was her studio assistant, and after at that time, she received the MacArthur Fellowships, and for me, she was like a hero, and I felt like bounds, and I felt like that I can't reach where she reached, and though I felt sort of discouraged, decided to leave to sort of focus on my own practice. And so, but at the same time, there was an elections, and I end up here the summer of 2008. President Obama won November 2008, and I felt like I was in the right place. Felt the change, felt the progress. I made a move for it, and I ended up here. And so, but yeah.
Who is this woman?
That's my grandmother. There's two sides. So my grandmother, who experienced both the French War and also the American, well, we call it the Vietnam War, but they call it the American War in Vietnam. She experienced two wars. And at the first war, the French came and placed mines all throughout our farms to sort of ward off guerrilla fighters, but at the same time tell them, don't come here. And then my grandfather thought there was robbers in there, so he decided to run. Our whole family had been told, look, we're putting mines in front of your house. Do not step on here, this area. And because my grandfather at that time thought there was a burglar, he ran right out, and as he ran right out, he stepped on the mine, and my grandmother had to raise all four of her children. One passed away, but three survived. Because of that, three of her children made 3 journeys separately, and then finally, she sort of had to wait. Every time one of her children leave, it's heartbreaking for her because we never know what happened because there was no communications between America and Vietnam. So oftentimes the only thing that we can do is take pictures, send it home. Pictures became a code between my family and our family in Vietnam. Like for example, she took pictures here of the Philippines. That's a send back home saying, hey, we survived, we made it, we're here. We don't literally write and say, hi mom, I made it to the Philippines, you can be safe. The only way we communicate was through decoding of the photography, of using pictures as a way to indicate what's happening to us. And for three times, one's in 70s, one in the 80s, and then finally she get to leave Vietnam as President Clinton lifted the embargo. We were able to sponsor her and my uncle, the last child, to come to the United States. And so for her, she's always been standing at one point, watching her children throwing themselves into dangers in order to make it to safety. And for her, she's experienced 2 wars, 3 children leaving the country, and then finally herself made it at the end. And so she became the end point, whereas my aunt, who first left, became the beginning point.
You participate along with National Portrait Gallery with...
Yes, it is. I was able to make a whole painting of that moment, and that was the reason why I made that was because during COVID, another grandmother was attacked in San Francisco, and so for me to hear news of an Asian elderly woman to get attacked, not to think of just she being Asian, but just a grandmother. I mean, I have grandmother, you have grandmother, everyone has grandmother. To attack a defenseless woman on a street, what must that be like? And who is she, and how is it that she get to be attacked at this point? And so for me, I utilized that opportunity to make this whole scenery, recapturing my grandmother on this idyllic by the sea, on the hillside, standing, waiting, because we always have this sort of like romanticized stories of a woman who's always waiting for her husband to come home from war. It's a very sort of traditional Asian story of a woman standing on this cliff of holding her baby, waiting for, but for me, I want to memorialize my grandmother. Here she is standing here waiting, and yes, that was the pictures that I painted, much bigger than this, and more details, because I want to create a notions of her. But here, a lot of image you see are either black and white. I remove the skin colors, but also a lot of sometimes facial feature structures, because I'm thinking of how, you know, photography has always, I've been a Susan Sontag's, I love Susan Sontag and her idea of the pain through the photography, what's real, thinking about how photography sort of talks about these things that are real. But ever since the internet and Photoshops, I'm seeing how photography move away from the real or the pain that is real. And so for me, I'm beginning to think about how can I begin to take some of these photographs that I have and talk about memory or fragmented memory of my childhood that sometime is it because of trauma that I block out, or is it because I can't deal with the issues at that time that allow me to understand the factuals? And so a lot of time I'm using black and white as a way to get into the talk about the notions of photography, the questions about how do we deal with pain and trauma. And also too, the other thing is, as you can see here, these are bacteria eating away the photograph. Some of these photographs that was made for us in the refugee camp were laminated, and when they laminate, the bacteria is still inside of it. And as it's aged, it's slowly eating away. And for me, I'm doing the reverse. I'm trying to capture the things that are being eaten away as a way to sort of preserve and begin to think about other notions about photography and things that trauma. How do I deal with trauma? I'm thinking I'm diving into trauma, but I don't know yet. I got to talk to a psychiatrist. Any other questions I can help answer?
Hi, Con.
Hi.
Can you tell me about this one over here? This piece seems to stand out because I'm looking at the patterning, and this one seems to be a different approach than the other ones.
Yeah. A lot of it is, I talked about earlier about how I want to begin to move away. How do I create relief in my, I think I'm beginning to think about sculptural painting at this moment. How do I construct it that they come out from that space? Because I think since 2016, I've been approached the painting space as a containers. And so now as I approach more of this, how do I connect to things that are hanging, to things that are coming out? And I think in my practice right now, I am looking at way to sort of thinking of moving patterns from inside to outside, because I feel like oftentimes I don't know how to connect the past to the present. And for me, these things have become sort of like here in this moment, this presence right now. But how do I connect? It's almost like umbilical core? Umbilical core. Okay, I don't know how to say that word. So it's like it's sort of connected to your sense of self. That these photographs are sort of my sense of self, but as it move on into the physical space and engage with the people, how do I make that connected past to the present? I think that's what I think I'm dealing with. I don't know yet, but I'm thinking I'm still struggling with the messaging of it, but I think that's what is happening between installations and painting. And I am trying to make a connection between the things that I am painting to the things that I am building around and in front of other people's. Thank you guys for being here. I hope you guys if you have any other questions, feel free to ask. I love to tell you more, but thank you for coming.